Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have the right, police unions, and stats. And that's posted by Weekly Junket 5227. That's a self-post. They said, I think one of the reasons why society is often accepting of a police state is due to propagandic statements. As a whole, society is more apt to believe that policing is the number one most dangerous job in America. However, the facts don't reflect this. It's not even in the top 10. It actually isn't even in the top 20. It's 22 to be exact. I'm not seeing conservatives and police unions saying things like, trees don't shoot people, or something about intentional violence. First, the statement kind of takes a dump on firefighters because they're first responders too. Second, those other jobs are dangerous. Finally, they're still trying to justify having a police state by playing with facts. What gives? Who do people who don't want a police state deal with that talking point? And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if the police want to market their job as being exceptionally dangerous, that's fine. I have seen some body cam footage of them getting charged at by people, and yeah, policing can be a dangerous job. I agree with that. But that being said, it might not be as the danger factor might depend. It really depends on where you are. It'd be much safer to be a police person, I would say, out in the suburbs than it would be deep in the inner city, especially with, how, I think, some people might say, oh, that's because, it's a genetic thing, but I personally think it's more of a cultural thing, because, it's a lot of people in the urban city, they do stuff like gangster rap and all that, and violence is more pervasive, I would say, in their way of in the way of life of people who live there. A lot of whom being, of course, dark skinned. Of course, Reddit would see that as racist, but regardless, crime does know no boundaries. That's important to remember as well. But some areas definitely are more dangerous to the police than others. But regardless, personally, I think the libertarian positions, we shouldn't have the police because, the big problem is that they're just an arm of the state. They're not supposed to protect you. They're supposed to protect the state and its interests first and foremost. So that's why I would say instead of the police, we should have the private militia enforcing the laws rather than the state. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have breaking. Trump DOJ deliberates over gun ban for transgenders. Posted from DailyWire.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think that's not good. But because the more conservative argument that Trump's using is, well, they have mental illness, so if they might be more likely to hurt other people. Well, I would make the counterpoint that, ultimately, whether or not you consider transgenderism as a mental illness is irrelevant. It's really about, the state can throw the label mentally ill at whoever they want to in order to take away their guns, and that's a slippery slope you're dealing with here. I personally do think, a lot of transgender people are mentally ill, like the one that just shot up the school in Minnesota. But, ultimately that's not an excuse to take anyone's guns rights away. Shall not be infringed does not mean shall not be infringed if unless you have a mental illness, as I said, I don't think mentally ill people should be getting guns, but ultimately, people will justify what they justify regardless of the system and government in place. And that you definitely need to remember that, especially when it comes to firearms, because they say, oh, the woke progressives say, oh, we just need more gun-free zones. Well, in reality, just a gun-free zone, guns don't magically disappear in gun-free zones. The sad truth is when everyone's armed, that's probably the safest option, because if everyone's armed, then someone's gonna be afraid to shoot up everyone. Because everyone, they know they might be it would just be stopped right away. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump claims the power to summarily kill suspected drug smugglers from nytimes.com, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they added, by ordering the U.S. military to summarily kill a group of people aboard what he said was a drug smuggling boat, President Trump used the military in a way that he had yet no clear legal precedent or basis, according to specialists in the laws of war and executive power. And yeah, that just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter what the actual law says. It matters what the government's willing to enforce. Trump knows very well that the definition of power is is pretty much whatever anyone in charge says it is, and a lot of people just say the president's in charge. So he realizes that he can get away with pretty much whatever he wants to, as long as it doesn't hurt him or his party's popularity that much. And yeah, personally, I said, I think if he could get away with it, we probably would have an invasion of Venezuela. But I do think boots on the ground invasion would hurt him and his party too much, especially after how big a failure the Iraq War was. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have Massey exposes White House threats against him over Epstein petition from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I definitely do like what Massey's work he's doing in trying to expose the Epstein files. But Trump, when he senses any dissent at all in his ranks, he'll go after it, and that's why he's going after Massey so hard currently. Massey, it's someone I really respect. I personally don't like to go for either of the two major parties when it comes to elections, but if he gets nominated by the Republican Party for president, I might make an exception for him because I would generally regret him losing if I didn't end up voting for him. So yeah, so personally, I think it's also interesting that Reddit says all Republicans are bad, but they're supporting Thomas Massey here because he's going after the orange man, and that just goes to show you Reddit has no values other than being anti-Trump at this point. I personally like Thomas Massey, not because he's Republican, because I think he's principled, but Reddit only cares because he's going after Trump. Then we have Trump to rename Defense Department to War Department from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added thanks Dave Smith from Mises Caucus, I guess because they endorsed Trump over Kamala and Chase Oliver, Libertarian Party nominee. But regardless, personally, I personally think this is probably one of the good things Trump has done. It's pretty, he might have said he was the pro-peace candidate, but it's the Department of Defense doesn't really do defense, and it's always been more of a War Department, even after they changed the name after the Second World War. So I think this is just Trump being honest for once. Personally, I would get rid of the department entirely, but it is more accurate for it to be named the War Department than the Defense Department. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump's drug boat drone strike shows how terrorism makes everyone killable from Reason.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, that's what I would agree with that. Personally, I think terrorism is an inherently subjective word. The state will label any dissent at all to its authority as terrorism if it feels like it. And yeah, ultimately, that's why I personally don't really care for the term. It's like pirates and emperors. When the state does something, it's the empire and it's 100% legal. But if it was a private actor doing it, it'd be 100% labeled as terrorism and treated as such. So yeah, that's why I personally don't care for terrorism. It's simply a way for the state to discredit all non-state violence and for the state to justify its legal monopoly on the use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then next we have Republicans resurface anti-trans attacks in the closing stretch of the Virginia governor's race from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, this is just another "gee, Republicans bad" post. That's pretty much all Reddit is at this point. But yeah, ultimately, Reddit's gonna label any dissent against the official transgender narrative at all as anti-trans. And, ultimately, I do think the libertarian position is, if you want to identify as trans, great, but that doesn't mean you should be entitled to respect, and you should be able to question things even if the official narrative says otherwise. Reddit always loves to market itself as a super skeptical and website that loves to question everything, but then the official narrative comes knocking at the door, and suddenly, that goes out the window. It's like, I was on, I said this in the last episode, I think, but I was on the Skeptic subreddit recently, and I said, where was it? I'm looking for it. Let's see. It was on a post about vaccines, and let's see. Yeah, I said, it's funny that this is the Skeptic subreddit, yet attacks any skepticism whatsoever when it comes to vaccines. And that got 11 downvotes, which shows, Reddit, they don't want you breaking up the circle jerk and questioning things that go against the official narrative. You need to always follow the party line, or else they'll throw every label in the book at you, like Hitler, Nazi, fascist, etc., etc. And that's why increasingly those labels don't mean anything anymore. Then we have the Trump administration is attempting to take away Second Amendment rights for trans Americans, from posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Iron Front USA subreddit. And that was like a tweet from some Mary Margaret Olohan out, and that's about how they're trying to take away guns from trans Americans. And yeah, personally, I don't know if a lot of transgender people are mentally healthy enough to get to use guns, but even so, it doesn't matter, because if they try and take away guns from one group, they can just by taking away from any group they feel like. So, ultimately, it's a pitfall that the Republican Party falls into a lot, I would say. They'll say, oh, well, if this is good. Well, if we do, it's good. But it sets the precedent that when the Democrats take power, they'll be able to use it against a lot of Republicans groups. Like on Reddit, I'm sure Reddit would label being a Republican or a Libertarian, for that matter, or pretty much any party other than Democrat, as mental illness, and that might be used just by taking away the guns of Americans and who or question the official narrative. And it just goes to show you that, it's ultimately, you shouldn't be justifying expanding the state regardless of how noble your intention might be. Then we have a senator just unapologetically declared the U.S. a white homeland, from Slate.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, of course, Reddit's always going to go after a Republican senator for whatever they say. But it's interesting how Tim Kaine, the Democratic senator from Virginia and Hillary's running mate in 2016, he said, "Oh, our rights don't come from our God or Creator. They don't come from within. They come from the state. They come from the government." And that was directly against what the founding fathers said, but Reddit doesn't care about that, and if they did, they'll just find a way, they'll just sweep it under the rug, or say, ultimately, our rights do come from the state. And yeah, it just goes to show you that Reddit, whenever the out group says something stupid, they're all over it. But whenever the in group does it, it's either going to be buried or they'll find a way to justify it. Then finally we have DOJ Deputy Chief Joseph Schmidt was caught on a hidden camera saying the government will redact every Republican from the Epstein files and leave only the Democrats. He also revealed that Ghislaine Maxwell was transferred to a minimum security to keep her mouth shut, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Good News subreddit. And yeah, it's interesting. That video was filmed by James O'Keefe, formerly of the Project Veritas, but currently of O'Keefe Media Group. And it just goes to show you, Reddit's had him in the out group for years because he's exposed a lot of woke people, like how they're having all the woke stuff in the schools. But the second he turns on Trump and said, Reddit suddenly loves him and treats him as a reliable source. And that just goes to show you that, Reddit has no values other than Orange Man bad. I'm sure if Adolf Hitler came back from the dead and said Orange Man bad, Reddit would say, well, it was 80 years ago. He's probably moved on from all that. And it just goes to show you, it's if you don't want to like Orange Man, that's fine. But when you have no values other than Orange Man bad, it shows you're an inherently unprincipled person who will follow whatever the official narrative says to. If Trump says, if Trump says don't drink your piss, I'm sure all the woke Redditors will be drinking their piss left and right. And yeah, personally, I don't really like Trump. I think he's a combative asshole and a spaz. But, just because Trump says something, or it doesn't mean it's inherently wrong. And yeah, it's just, yeah. But that being said, I do agree with Reddit on the Epstein file stuff, and with James O'Keefe here, that, they're trying to increasingly use the Epstein files as a way to throw the Democrats into the bus while protecting themselves, when in reality, both major parties need to be held accountable for their role in all the Epstein stuff. And that's my thoughts there. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.